Before beginning, the researcher who reconstructed this case discreetly asks you to note in the comments which city you are watching from and what time it is there now, so that the time of this account is also archived along with the story. The winter of 1907 in the village of Greyhollow is remembered in the archives not for the severity of the snow, but for the silence it left behind. Among the yellowed pages of official records, there is a set of documents in which something seems to have been carefully removed, as if someone had decided that certain passages from that season should not survive the test of time. Greyhollow, at the time, was little more than a dot on the map. A cluster of wooden houses scattered along a narrow road, surrounded by low hills and dark woods. The name came from the grey valley that formed there in the cold months, when the fog descended early and only dissipated around noon. Freight trains cut through the region twice a day, carrying wood, wool supplies, and occasionally people who did not intend to stay. For those who travelled, Greyhollow was a place of passage. For those who lived there, it was the centre of a small, quiet, and predictable world. At the top of one of these hills stood the Greyhollow sisters' house. It was neither a mansion nor a miserable shack, a light-colored wooden two-story house with a sloping roof to support the weight of the snow, a simple porch in front, and a long attic that dominated the structure like a watchful eye on the road. Property tax records and two period photographs confirm what residents later described. A solid, well-maintained building with a row of small windows upstairs, always lit later than usual. The two protagonists of this historical archive were Eleanor and Miriam Greyhollow. Eleanor, the younger of the two, was 29 in 1907. Miriam was 34. Their ages are noted in the parish tax book, alongside their occupations summarized in a few words. Hostess for Miriam, assistant for Eleanor. Daughters of a railroad worker who had died years earlier in a work accident and a seamstress who had succumbed to pneumonia, the sisters had inherited the house and a small amount of money that would not allow them to live without working. So they turned the attic into a collective room for travelers who needed to stay overnight between trains, especially in the months when the roads became almost impassable. The testimonies collected decades later converge on a similar portrait. Eleanor was considered more sociable, though discreet, with a polite smile and an eye for detail. She was the one who welcomed travelers, lit the lamps, and served hot soup and fresh bread on snowy nights. Miriam, on the other hand, was seen as more reserved, almost severe, dedicated to accounting, repairs, and negotiations with suppliers. If Eleanor was the welcoming face of the house, Miriam was the structure that kept it standing. The community viewed the two with a mixture of respect and distance. There were no scandals involving the family, no obvious rumors in the local newspaper records, nor compromising mentions in the church minutes. The sisters attended services regularly, paid their taxes on time, participated in some local school events, and occasionally contributed clothing donations to widows and children. Still, they were described as women who preferred to stay at home, women with few friends, women who listened more than they spoke. In a small village, that was enough to surround them with a discreet aura of mystery. The winter of 1907, according to the correspondence of a local doctor and the parish priest's notes, was particularly grey. Long snowstorms, constant winds, a feeling of suspended time. There are mentions of partially blocked tracks, postponed trips, ox carts stuck in frozen mud. It is in this scenario that the Greyhollow sisters' attic gains relevance. Travelers, railroad workers, traveling salesmen, and even the occasional government official would have passed through the so-called winter loft between January and March of that year. The winter loft is mentioned in two types of documents: in the guest book kept by Miriam, now partially preserved, and in letters sent by travelers to their families, recovered much later by researchers interested in reconstructing the flow of people through the region. Sensory details emerge from the letters: the smell of dry wood, the heat from the wood stove rising through the floor, the way the snow hit the roof at night, creating a muffled, constant sound that woke many people up without them knowing what time it was. Almost all accounts mention the presence of one of the sisters at night, sometimes Eleanor, sometimes Miriam, climbing the narrow staircase with a lamp in her hand to check that everything was okay. So far, nothing deviates from what would be expected of a modest boarding house in a cold and isolated region. However, when the current researcher moves from letters and parish records to official county documents, something begins to sound off. Where there should be a continuous sequence of notes, names, dates, traveler identification numbers, lodging payment receipts, there are gaps, pages torn out, lines scratched out, stamps covering sections that in other files remained intact. In one of the City Hall reports, there is a brief note almost hidden in the footer of a page. Greyhollow Loft Guest Register, partially unusable due to damage and subsequent corrections. There is no explanation of what kind of damage or who authorized the corrections. In the municipal archive inventory, there is a mention of a grey folder, incomplete contents, relating to the property of the Greyhollow sisters, followed by a comment in pencil, check cuts from 1907. The sisters' house continues to appear on property lists up to a certain point. Then the property is described only as a structure in dispute, and finally disappears under the simplification of old house at the top of the valley, demolished. There is no demolition decree attached. There is no photograph of the house in ruins, only the confirmation that at some point it ceased to exist as a physical space and began to survive only as a set of vague references. When the researcher finally has access to what remains of the Winterloft's guest book, stored in a box with other worn documents, the feeling of absence takes concrete form. The first pages are clear: dates, names, professions, origins. Travelers passing through, traveling salesman, a teacher, 2 soldiers on leave, a watchmaker. The handwriting changes, but the pattern remains the same. The record is methodical, regular, almost bureaucratic. Until suddenly, the dates reach February 1907, and the order breaks down. From a certain point on, the entries become irregular. Some days seem to condense more guests than would be reasonable for such a small village. Others, which should have been busy because of snowstorms, appear completely blank. On at least 3 pages, the ink is so scratched off that one can only guess what was written there. On another, an entire rectangle has been removed with a blade, leaving a hole in the paper. At the end of the last legible page before this mutilated section, there is a line that has become central to any attempt to reconstruct the case. Date, partially erased. 3 travelers without luggage, arriving on the night train, lodged in the winter attic. Payment in advance. Note by Miriam G. After that, the book becomes a field of torn paper silence. And it is precisely at this point, between the mention of 3 travelers without luggage and the abrupt void that follows, that the story of the Greyhollow sisters begins to escape the official record and is lost in conflicting versions, fragmented memories and pages that someone at some point decided to erase. In the months leading up to the winter of 1907, the Greyhollow sisters' lives followed a rhythm that at first glance seemed immune to the changes in the world around them. The train station continued to receive the same freight cars, the same passing workers. The villagers went shopping, attended church services, and went about their routines with the same quiet discipline that had marked the region since its founding. Nothing, apparently, indicated that this would be the last complete cycle in which the 2 sisters would be seen as part of local daily life. Eleanor used to go down to the village 2 or 3 times a week. She carried baskets of supplies, dry firewood, flour, preserved vegetables, and always brought something back to the house: a new blade for the stove, a package of wool for sewing blankets, a bottle of medicine recommended by the doctor to relieve Miriam's frequent cough. Many residents remember her walking along the road, always wrapped in a dark shawl, her boots leaving light footsteps on the damp earth. She was known for her quiet kindness. She didn't talk much, but she greeted everyone, her gaze carrying an attentiveness that seemed to perceive things before they were said. Miriam, on the other hand, almost never came downstairs. She spent hours doing the accounting, reviewing the guest book notes, organizing the house for winter. Testimonies collected decades later describe her as someone who suffered from chest pains since late fall, which forced her to avoid long periods of exertion. Some travelers reported seeing a handkerchief tucked into the sleeve of her dress, used to disguise coughing fits that she was keen to hide. Others, however, mentioned seeing her sitting near the attic windows, watching the road as if waiting for something or someone. The winter loft, though simple, was organized with almost meticulous care. Hand-sewn blankets, lamps cleaned daily, trunks where travelers could store their belongings. The narrow staircase connecting the ground floor to the attic creaked characteristically. Many guests remembered waking up to the sound of light footsteps going up or down during the night. Eleanor claimed it was just her checking the windows. Miriam said it was the wind. The truth was never clearly established. Travelers who passed through the house in late 1906 and early 1907 described the sisters' curious habits, although none of them, taken individually, suggested anything worrisome. A fabric salesman noted in a letter to his brother that Miriam seemed to have a certain obsession with the order of objects in the room, lamps lined up with millimeter precision, cups always placed with the handle facing the same way, rugs stretched so precisely that he believed he saw ruler marks on the floor. A railroad worker mentioned that Eleanor avoided letting guests talk to each other for too long, especially at night. She said that rest was essential for travelers, but the way she interrupted conversations seemed carefully rehearsed. There was also a detail, little commented on, but present in scattered testimonies. The attic always had a window open, even on the coldest days, even during snowstorms. Guests believed it was to prevent smoke from the stove from accumulating, but curiously, the stove was not in the attic. When asked, Eleanor replied that the air there needed to circulate, without further explanation. Another intriguing habit was Miriam's private notebook, different from the guest book. Small, with a dark leather cover, it was almost always kept in a locked drawer. Eleanor did not seem to have access to it. Only once was an entry in this notebook recorded by an outsider. A railroad worker, staying for 2 nights, said he saw Miriam writing something quickly when he heard footsteps on the stairs, as if she wanted to finish before someone came up. He unintentionally noticed a line written at the top of the page. Movement has increased beyond expectations. Adjust records. Despite these scattered signs, daily life seemed to follow its normal course. The sisters planted, cooked, sewed, welcomed guests, and took care of the house. Eleanor cleaned the banisters, arranged the mattresses, and checked the window locks before going to sleep. Miriam organized bills, reviewed food inventories, and corresponded with suppliers in the neighboring town. Nothing indicated a disruption, until in mid-January, something began to change. Neighbors' accounts describe an unusual increase in traffic on the road leading to the sisters' house. Carriages arriving at dusk, men walking in pairs with small backpacks, and even a group of hunters who, according to reports, were looking for temporary shelter before heading into the hills. However, there are no official records of these visits. None of the names appear in City Hall archives, station traveler lists, or lodging receipts. It is as if they passed through without leaving any documented footprints. Eleanor seems to have noticed this silent flow as her trips to the village became more frequent and shorter. She would come down, buy only the basics, and hurry back, as if in a rush to arrive. A local lunch lady recalled hearing Eleanor ask discreetly, almost in a whisper, if extra trains had been added during that winter. The employee did not know how to answer. Miriam, who rarely went out, was seen twice on her way to the station, always looking over her shoulder as if afraid of being followed. The last time anyone claimed to have seen her walking out of her house was in late January. She clutched her dark-covered notebook tightly, and the wind lifted her skirt as she stared intently up the valley toward the loft. Days later, some residents began to report sounds coming from the house at night, not screams or commotion, but muffled noises, like hurried conversations or objects being moved. A shepherd passing by early in the morning noticed that the attic windows remained lit until well after midnight. The lamps burned too brightly, he noted in a personal notebook, as if someone wanted to keep the darkness away at all costs. Another neighbor mentioned seeing Eleanor collecting snow in a bucket with her bare hands near the side shed. Eleanor's expression, she said, was one of exhaustion, but also of urgency. The weeks passed with a silent tension that the residents only noticed in retrospect. The movement of travelers did not diminish. On the contrary, it became more constant, more discreet, more difficult to explain. Sometimes people no one recognized would stop in front of the house, stay there for a few minutes, and leave without knocking on the door. Other times, they arrived late at night, when the road should have been empty. In early February, a passing merchant said he saw Miriam outside the house, watching the road with an expression he described as a mixture of calculation and fear. Noticing that she was being watched, she immediately retreated inside, closing the door before he could greet her. The last clear record of normality is in a letter written by Eleanor to a distant friend, dated February 2nd, 1907. She mentions tiring days, long nights, and a phrase that would become deeply meaningful to investigators decades later. "Sometimes I think we are getting more than we should, and I don't know if Miriam is telling everything." It is the last known letter written by one of the sisters, and curiously, it is also the last correspondence sent from the house before the records begin to fail, exactly at the time when the mysterious 3 travelers without luggage first appear in the guest book. And it is here, in this overlap of discrete signs, that the winter of 1907 begins to narrow in an unsettling way, setting the stage for the night when everything would cease to be routine and become history. The archives referring to early February 1907 are scarce, but when gathered together, they outline a sequence of events that, although fragmented, form a tenuous and disturbing line. It is from these, the last letters, the belated testimonies, the surviving notes in the guest book, and the scattered mentions in the town hall minutes, that researchers still attempt to reconstruct the night that marked the disappearance of the Greyhollow sisters. The last reliable record dates from February 5th, 1907, when 3 travelers without luggage arrived in the village by night train. There are no names in the surviving documents, only a vague mention. Men of tired appearance, dark clothes, few words. They did not present identification and paid in advance, something unusual for such modest accommodations. The station clerk who sold them the tickets only noted that they did not intend to stay in the village for more than one night. Still, they set off down the road that led to the Greyhollow sisters' house, a choice that for many historians remains unexplained. The afternoon before the night witnesses report that on the afternoon of the 5th, Eleanor was seen in the village, although she seemed profoundly different from previous days. Her gait was faster, her face hidden under her shawl, and she bought supplies that did not match the normal activity of the boarding house. Too much flour, too much firewood, too many lamps. The local grocery store noted that when she paid, her hands trembled slightly, as if she were cold. Although there was no strong wind at the time. She returned home before sunset, carrying 2 bags and repeatedly looking back at the road behind her. Miriam, on the other hand, was not seen that afternoon. However, a shepherd who kept flocks near the valley reported many years later that he had seen movement in the window of the winter loft. The lamp lit in the attic, still bright, flickered as if someone were moving between the beds. "Quick, short steps," he described, like someone tidying up something that needs to be ready before the others arrive. The arrival of the 3. Around 8 o'clock at night, when it was already completely dark, 3 silhouettes walked along the narrow road and were seen by a distant neighbor returning from his brother-in-law's house. He described them as 3 men, not talking to each other, stepping on the snow as if trying not to make any noise. None of them carried a trunk, suitcase, or even a backpack. Their clothes, though dark, were too dry for someone who had walked from the train to the top of the valley during a light snowfall. In the distance, the man saw the door of the sisters' house open slowly. The light from inside formed a yellow rectangle on the snow. One of the female figures, believed to be Eleanor, appeared on the threshold. She did not retreat, did not call Miriam, did not raise a lamp. She just let them in. The door closed. And from then on, there are no more confirmed eyewitnesses. The beginning of the night. Around 9 o'clock, residents at the foot of the valley reported seeing lights passing through the upstairs windows. The lamps were moved from side to side, as if someone were walking through the attic with unusual frequency. The light flickered, then remained static for long minutes, then moved again. The wind was calm that night. There was no storm. The silence surrounding the windows could not be explained by the weather. Downstairs, according to the still legible entry in the guest book, Miriam had written, "3 guests arrived. Check room. Adjust numbers after inspection." There is no signature. The handwriting is hers, but smaller than usual, slanted to the right, as if written in haste or hesitation. Noises. In the attic. Around 11 o'clock, the pastor who occasionally passed by on the road heard something coming from the direction of the house. They were not screams, but neither were they everyday sounds. He wrote in a private notebook. It sounded like furniture being dragged, but slowly, as if someone was trying not to make any noise. He continued walking, believing that the sisters were just rearranging the loft to accommodate the new guests. Minutes later, he heard another sound. Footsteps. Many footsteps fast, as if several people were moving simultaneously on the upper floor. Something, perhaps a bed, perhaps a trunk, was moved, causing a low, dry noise. There were no outside lights. There were no voices, only muffled movements, coming from a space where complete silence normally reigned at that hour. The pastor recorded, "I thought about following, but it would be an invasion." The sound stopped as abruptly as it had begun. Midnight. At midnight, the loft lamp was so bright that a distant neighbor commented in a later statement that it seemed to light up the sky above the house. This, however, contradicts reports from travelers that the sisters saved oil at all costs. Why, then, keep so many lamps lit at the same time? A few minutes later, the light suddenly dimmed, and then, nothing. No sound, no movement, only the silence of winter filling the valley. The last verifiable evidence. The most intriguing document found among the fragments of the county archive is a single sheet of paper with no precise date, but with Miriam's unmistakable handwriting. The text is incomplete, cut in the middle by an old tear. They asked for the loft. They said it would only be for one night. Eleanor doesn't think it's wise, but if the numbers are right, there will be no choice. We have to comply. The sentence ends on the torn paper, burned at the edges by damage not explained in the municipal inventory. It is not known what those numbers were, nor what "there will be no choice" meant, nor what they were supposed to comply with. The last recorded movement. Around 1 in the morning, a railroad employee returning from a shift heard what he described as a dull thud, followed by a brief tremor in the ice beneath his feet. He believed at the time that it was just the wood of the house yielding to the weight of the snow, something relatively common that winter. However, when he looked toward the valley, he noticed that all the lights in the house were off. The loft, which half an hour earlier had been shining like a beacon, was now plunged into complete darkness. It was unusual for the sisters to turn off the lamp so early when they had guests. It was also unusual for no windows to emit even a glimmer of light. The employee stood still for a few seconds, listening to the night. No noise, no voices, no doors. Only what he described as the kind of silence that doesn't seem natural for an occupied house. What came next? Later records, the few that survived, indicate that the next person to approach the house would do so only the following morning. Until then, the hours would remain empty, without witnesses, without notes, without detectable movement. And it is precisely in this void, in this interval of absolute darkness, that the Greyhollow sisters are believed to have disappeared. When the first visitor climbed the hill at dawn, he found something that would forever change the understanding of that winter. But that account belongs to the next block. The next morning, the first person to climb the hill was not an authority figure but an ordinary man, accustomed to seeing that house as part of the landscape. It was the same railroad employee who, hours earlier, had heard the dull thud in the silent night. He climbed with the vague intention of asking if the sisters needed anything, using the excuse of delivering a note from the station. In his later statement, he wrote that he did not know exactly what he expected to find, but it was not that. The front door was neither wide open nor locked. It was just ajar. A small detail, but unusual for those women who, according to everyone, had a habit of checking the locks 2 or 3 times before going to sleep. When he pushed it open, the man describes a strange feeling. There was no obvious disorder, no sign of a struggle, but there was also no sound typical of an occupied house. No pots and pans clattering, no footsteps on the wooden floor, no voices. The kitchen still bore traces of the previous night. On the table were the remains of a meal, plates with dried soup stains, breadcrumbs, misaligned cutlery. 4 places. On one of the plates the food was almost untouched. On another, the bread was broken in half, as if someone had been interrupted before taking a second bite. The fireplace, still with extinguished embers, exuded a dead heat, a last breath of life from a night that was no longer there. In the hallway, the man called out the sisters' names. No answer. The room was in order. Miriam's belongings, the chair by the window, the inkwell, the account book, remained in their places. Eleanor's coat still hung on the hook near the entrance. On the hanger next to it, Miriam's shawl remained folded, ready to be worn. Nothing suggested that 2 women had decided to leave voluntarily before dawn. The staircase to the winter loft creaked as usual, but according to the report, that sound seemed louder, as if denouncing an invasion. He climbed slowly, one hand on the railing, the other holding the note that would never be delivered. When he reached the top, he pushed open the attic door. What he found there would be described, many decades later, as an interrupted order. The beds were unmade, the blankets crumpled, as if they had been used by more than one body during the night. 3 of them had clear indentations, marks of recent warmth preserved on the surface of the mattress, according to contemporary accounts. On the 4th bed, the one that was usually used by one of the sisters when she needed to sleep near the guests, the sheet was stretched taut, immaculate, as if no one had ever lain there. A window remained ajar, letting in a trickle of cold air. On the floor, a trail of melted snow created an irregular pattern, running from the window to the center of the attic, where it ended in a dark stain, difficult to identify with precision. There was no blood. There were no clearly distinguishable footprints, only marks blurred by the melting. On a small table next to the stairs, the guest book lay open. The last legible lines mentioned the 3 travelers without luggage. After that, only a mutilated passage, torn paper, scraped ink, an absence so evident that it drew more attention than any words. The man went downstairs, left the house without touching anything else, and went to seek help. The local authorities, a county representative, the head of the small village police station, and the parish priest came to the house a few hours later. The community, accustomed to dealing with misfortune with practical resignation, followed them at a respectful distance. The group went through the rooms, noted what they could, and lacking a more precise technical language, recorded the situation as unexplained disappearance of the Greyhollow sisters. The first hypothesis was simple: escape. Perhaps pressured by undisclosed debts or some kind of threat, the 2 had left with the 3 travelers. This version, however, did not stand up to scrutiny. All of Miriam's clothes were still in the closet. The household correspondence, organized in stacks tied with ribbons, remained there. The sisters' savings, coins and bills kept in a small wooden box, had not been touched. The second hypothesis arose from rumors: crime. That the 3 men without luggage had done something to the sisters during the night and taken their bodies, erasing all traces. This narrative, although fueled by fear, also fell apart upon closer inspection. There were no clear signs of a struggle, no broken pieces, no objects out of place that would indicate violence. The house seemed suspended at the exact moment the night had ended. It was only when one of the police station assistants, rummaging through drawers in search of documents, found Miriam's private notebook that the case began to take a different turn. The notebook, with a dark leather cover, contained notes that went beyond the usual records of a boarding house. There were columns of numbers that did not match the guest book, mentions of shipments and arrivals separate from the official accommodations, as well as veiled references to the railroad. Adjustment requested by the station, unregistered entry, agreement maintained, no receipts. One specific line caught the attention of the researcher who would analyze the notebook decades later. "Flow greater than agreed. We don't have the structure for so many. Our records can't keep up. If an inspection comes, we'll be exposed." This sentence, dated January 1907, suggested that the sisters were somehow involved in an informal arrangement involving the passage of people through the region without official documentation. It is unclear whether they were workers avoiding registration, debtors trying to start a new life, or individuals who simply wanted to disappear from the statistics. The fact is that over time, the winter loft seemed to have become more than just a room for travelers. It was a discreet transit point for people who did not want to be recorded anywhere. The presence of the three travelers without luggage began to be seen in a new light. Instead of ordinary guests, some began to suspect that they were emissaries, perhaps sent by someone from the railroad, perhaps by an outside authority, with the task of ending that unofficial flow or correcting the registration deviations. Miriam's note, "We must comply," began to be read as evidence of a commitment made under pressure. The investigation, however, did not advance much beyond that. Partly because of the limitations of the period, partly because of what happened next. In the months following their disappearance, the case of the Greyhollow sisters was gradually shifted from the realm of public curiosity to that of institutional convenience. The house, initially kept under observation, ended up being listed as disputed property due to the absence of recognized direct heirs. Neighbors collected some belongings at the request of the city under the justification of preventing looting. The loft was kept closed. At the same time, documents began to emerge that indicated a movement in the opposite direction. Instead of delving deeper into the case, some authorities seemed intent on reducing it to a footnote. An internal City Hall memo, partially recovered years later, contained the following instruction: avoid extensive mention of the Greyhollow sisters in annual reports. Situation resolved as voluntary abandonment of residence. Issues relating to the railroad dealt with in the appropriate forum. Another document from a regional office of the railroad company was even more direct. It is recommended to review and, if necessary, delete records that indicate irregular use of private property as unauthorized transit points. Such practice may compromise the company's image and attract unwanted scrutiny. It is in this context that contemporary researchers finally understand what it means to say that all records have been deleted. It was not an abrupt, dramatic erasure with fires and destroyed boxes. It was a slow administrative process made up of small decisions, a page torn out here, a line scratched out there, a stamp superimposed on a name, a report that was never attached. Over the years, the story of the Greyhollow sisters was diluted, summarized, simplified until it fit into a few words. Two women who disappeared in the winter of 1907. Nothing more. What remained were shadows. Shadows in the form of numerical gaps, unanswered letters, contradictory statements. Shadows in the form of objects left behind without explanation. Eleanor's coat, Miriam's shawl, the untouched savings box, and above all the house that at some point ceased to appear on official maps, as if it had never existed. Decades later, when a local historian decides to revisit the case, he finds one last clue in an unlikely place: the archive of a former county lawyer, now deceased. Among tax documents and land contracts, there is an envelope with no clear identification. Inside, a folded sheet of paper with the recognizable handwriting of Eleanor Greyhollow. The letter was never sent. It has no date, no explicit recipient, just a few incomplete lines. If anyone ever reads this, I hope they understand that it wasn't just our house that was emptied. There are people who pass through here as if they don't exist anywhere. We weren't the only ones who disappeared. We were just the easiest to forget. The letter ends abruptly, without a signature. Perhaps it was never finished. For the researcher who collects these fragments, this is the most human and most disturbing revelation of the entire case. There are no monsters hiding in the valley, no invisible forces in the snow. There is only a silent network of unrecorded passages, of people in transit, of numbers adjusted to fit official spreadsheets. And two women caught between the need to survive and the pressure to participate in something they knew they could not control. What exactly happened that February night? Whether the sisters were taken by force, whether they agreed to leave quietly to protect someone, whether they were moved elsewhere under the promise of anonymity, remains beyond the reach of the archives. The torn pages, the overlapping stamps, the house demolished without a formal decree, everything points less to a supernatural mystery and more to a deliberate agreement to forget. It is from this point that the narrator-historian, now in the present, finds himself compelled to leave the concrete facts and enter the realm of reflection, that of how many similar stories have been lost under the same layers of administrative silence. Decades have passed since the disappearance of the Greyhollow sisters. The hill where the house stood no longer bears any traces of the building. The land has been leveled, the fences have fallen, and the vegetation has reclaimed what winter once shaped. For those who visit the valley today, there is no indication that a home once stood there. A loft lit late into the night, a discreet point of passage that the archives insist on reducing to two poorly preserved lines. And yet, walking through that space, the contemporary researcher cannot shake the feeling that something remains, not an object, not a shadow, but an absence carefully constructed over more than a century. During years of research, he has become accustomed to dealing with gaps. Some stories survive in fragments, others crumble completely. But the case of the Greyhollow sisters carries a different kind of silence. An active silence shaped by people who, for administrative, political, or pragmatic reasons, decided that certain details should not survive the passage of time. This is not a dramatic mystery, but rather a slow, meticulous, almost patient emptying. What was erased was not only the last night, but the entire context that allowed it to be understood. The historian records in his field diary that all that remains of the sisters are disconnected fragments. A letter never sent, a mutilated guest book, numerical notes that do not add up, distant testimonies that contradict each other. But, upon reviewing each piece, he notices something that only reveals itself when the whole is observed calmly. The sisters' story did not disappear on its own. It was accompanied by dozens, perhaps hundreds of names that never made it into the official records. People who passed through Greyhollow with no intention of staying. People who lived on the margins of the railroad system. Workers in transit, women looking for a fresh start, men fleeing debts or memories. With each page torn out, it was not only Eleanor and Miriam's fate that was lost, it was also the traces of those who trusted that loft as a temporary refuge, a place where one could exist without being counted. The sisters' house served as an intersection between the documented and the undocumented, and when that intersection became inconvenient, it was dismantled piece by piece until it dissolved into administrative oblivion. But the researcher knows that human memory does not function like a municipal archive. It is not enough to cross out lines or delete reports to make the lingering question disappear. And the question, in the case of the Greyhollow sisters, is not what happened that night, but why did no one want us to know? He understands that the answer, though not clearly defined, lies in the sum of small clues, the irregular flow of travelers, the secret adjustments to the records, the presence of unidentified men, the sudden interest of the railroad, the systematic removal of documents. The researcher closes his notebook and observes the silent valley. The wind blows softly, touching the grass as if gliding over an ancient surface. The mountains on the horizon still retain the same grey hue described in the 1907 reports. Time, unlike paperwork, does not completely erase. It records in long, almost invisible layers, something that still insinuates itself. The echo of a routine that has been broken, of a house that has been erased, of two women whose names resist only because someone, at some point, let a fragment slip. Eleanor and Miriam left no heirs, were not sought by authorities outside the county, were not found anywhere else on the railroad. Their fate is not recorded in funeral records, nor in lists of missing persons who survived the first half of the century. They exist only here, in this uneven collection of memories, corroded papers, contradictory documents. And perhaps that is what makes the case so profound. Not the absence of explanation, but the awareness that at some point there was an explanation. Someone knew what happened. Someone wrote it down, noted it, recorded it, verified it. And someone later decided that it should not stand the test of time. They decided that two silent women living in a remote house were easily dispensable in the larger narrative of the region. The researcher sighs and puts his papers away in his leather briefcase. He walks slowly down the hill, taking care not to leave deep marks in the damp soil. He knows that when he leaves, there will be no indication that he was there. The hill will once again be just a field. The valley will once again be just a valley. The Greyhollow sisters will continue to belong to a blind spot in the collective memory, visible only when someone, out of curiosity or insistence, decides to collect tiny fragments and try to piece together what remains. Before descending, he looks one last time at the top of the valley. He imagines where the front door would be, where the staircase that creaked at night would be, where the open window of the loft let in the cold air. He tries to visualize Eleanor lighting lamps, Miriam writing numbers in her dark notebook, travelers resting in narrow beds while snow pounded on the roof. None of this exists anymore, but the image lingers in his mind like an inherited memory, not one he lived. It is at this moment that he understands something simple, profound, and difficult to put into words. Some stories do not disappear. They just wait for someone to give them back their name. And then, in complete silence, the valley remains watching.